Good evening, everyone. I'm Holly Kernan. I'm the Chief Content Officer for KQED, and we welcome you to one of our very first events from the KQED Live here in the Commons at our beautiful, newly renovated studio headquarters in San Francisco's Mission District. KQED, yeah, woo! KQED Live is a brand new multi-platform live event series, both here in person and streaming online. It's dedicated to bringing journalism to life on stage, amplifying local culture, and building community. We make KQED's mission to inform, inspire, and involve tangible here. And we do this through conversations, storytelling and performances, screenings, and other live interactive experiences, because the act of gathering together grows our senses of imagination and empathy and collective responsibility. So to make all of this possible, KQED has reimagined what a public media station can be, and we've transformed our home into a true community media center, where we welcome the public, like you, to be part of the conversation, to learn new skills, and to share understanding. And we want to thank all of you for being among the first members of the public to walk through our doors and to bring this vision to life. Your presence and participation are the most integral part of this work, and we hope you'll come to more programs throughout this season. You can learn more about everything on offer at kqed.org/live. And we also want to thank the KQED Live season sponsors who support our mission of civic and cultural engagement: Asian Art Museum, Berkeley Rep, Comcast Business, and Oakland International Airport. We are so grateful to their commitment to creating a more informed, inspired, and involved Bay Area. And we're excited to share tonight's conversation with California Secretary of State Shirley Weber and former Governor Jerry Brown. Their reflections, go ahead, give it up. Their reflections on their careers and the work of running California's distinctive electoral system couldn't be more timely in the wake of the recent recall, and while all over the country, threats to voting rights mount nationally. And now I would like to welcome our host for the evening, Scott Shafer. He is KQED's senior editor for politics and government, and he's the co-host of Political Breakdown. And in collaboration with the Oral History Center at UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library, Scott and his team produced a revealing portrait of Governor Brown's career with the podcast, The Political Mind of Jerry Brown. Please join me in welcoming Scott Shafer.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. Good to see everybody here. Did you get a chance to check out the photo booth out front? Do it on the way out if you didn't. It is, as Holly said, very appropriate that our very first conversation in this space with elected officials is with California's top election official, Secretary of State Shirley Weber. We're fresh off the recall. Of course, voting rights are under attack across the country. And it is really, we're looking forward to a really robust conversation with these two. And former Governor Jerry Brown, a lot of people don't know this unless you really know your history, but Jerry Brown was Secretary of State, elected in 1970. He was elected after basically it had been a family business for decades. A father and son named Jordan had been Secretaries of State. He came in just before Watergate, revolutionized that office and used it as a springboard to run for governor in 1974. On paper, these are two extremely different people, Shirley Weber and Jerry Brown. He is the son of a governor. She is the great-granddaughter of a slave and the daughter of a sharecropper who was, along with her family, chased out of Arkansas when she was 3 years old with a lynch mob behind them. And yet, their lives have overlapped in a lot of ways as well. He was Secretary of State at the age of 32. She's Secretary of State, became Secretary of State at the age of 72. And so you'd think, what do they have in common? But as you're going to hear tonight, I think they have sort of an odd couple relationship, which is, and I don't mean that in the best sense. They come from such different places, but they have a really fun chemistry, and I think we're going to get a chance to hear some of that. They both really are extraordinary people with extraordinary lives. They share a love of California and a passion for democracy. We're going to hear from both of them in a moment, but I want to start by introducing our Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
All right. And, obviously, people who have followed Sacramento for years know of you, but your life story is, I think, so interesting and so relevant to this topic of voting rights and this moment that we're in. And so I want to begin just by asking you to tell us a little bit more about, you were born in Hope, Arkansas, 2 years after Bill Clinton was born in Hope, Arkansas.
Yes.
And tell us about your family and what it even meant to be a sharecropper and how it was that he had to leave your dad.
You know, I was fortunate to have some very amazing parents, despite the poverty that we had and the challenges we had in life. But I was the sixth of 8 children, so at the time when we left Arkansas, I was the baby of the family. But my father was a person with tremendous pride in himself, and he understood how Jim Crow had limited his life immensely. He was not allowed to go beyond the 5th or 6th grade. My mother went to the 9th grade. His path had been carved out in terms of sharecropping because they owned some land, but the reality in the South is that you could not basically work your land unless you worked someone else's land first. So my father had always had a dispute about how much they paid you because you couldn't contest that. You could not contest the fact that you worked so hard, you produced this product, and now they didn't want to give you your fair share. And so my father was always very outspoken. His father was very afraid because his father had lived through the worst riot in the United States, which was in Elaine, Arkansas. And where they hunted people down for weeks and weeks and killed them in the fields because they were trying to organize a labor union for sharecroppers. So as a result, there was always this tension and fear, but my father would always fight and speak up. And so they realized that he became a liability. You know, that as long as he was there and his voice was being heard, it was going to make it difficult for them to continue what they were doing. So they had made plans to kill my father. And the word had gotten around in the town that they were going to do some terrorist activity and basically probably lynch my father. His family was very concerned, and as a result, they put him in a wagon in the middle of the night and took him to Texarkana, where he got on a train, barely able to read, and came to California, where my mother's mother had come years before. And he worked from August till the 1st of December, where he earned enough to bring all of his 6 children and his wife to California. So, you know, our family came under those circumstances, but we came into a place where my mother's family, mother and father was, so we had support from them and my uncle. And so it was really a unique situation that we came into. And, but my parents believed strongly in education, and they believed strongly in voting, because my father never got a chance to vote or register to vote in Hope, Arkansas. And my grandparents, his parents, never got a chance to vote in their entire life because they died before 1965.
Was your dad able to vote in California?
Oh, definitely.
As soon as you got here? You got here in what, 55 or so?
1951. My dad started voting. We eventually moved into the projects. He was a strong advocate for it. But the unique thing was my mother voted, and eventually she started working in the polls, because they were so committed to it. And so making very little, you go work the polls, and she enjoyed it. And when we moved out of the Pueblos, the projects, to a house on 45th Street in Los Angeles, our house actually became the voting place. It was a polling place because our schools didn't have enough space because of the number of kids in the school. We didn't have a local library nearby or a rec center, those things that people use, and we weren't near a church, interestingly enough. So as a result, my mother volunteered our house, and our home, the living room, became the polling place at 351 West 45th Street.
Wow.
And it was there until my mother died. And both of my parents took tremendous pride in elections, so that my father said, they can't vote in the garage because the garage is full of spiders and stuff like that. So he and my brother would take all the furniture out of the living room, and he would work to set up all the booths. And so we knew as kids that when we came home when I was in middle school, that you went down the driveway to the back because important business like voting was taking place in the living room. So it was very much a part of our family's culture and ideas, and my father felt very strongly that you had to vote. And he would argue with people. It was interesting when we lived in the projects, because we weren't on welfare, but so many of the others were. My father couldn't figure out why people on welfare didn't vote. He said, don't you understand? You are totally dependent upon the government. You should be the first one in line to vote.
Yeah.
So voting was a part of our lifestyle.
Yeah.
And all of my brothers and sisters registered to vote. We voted in every election. I don't think I've ever missed an election since I turned 21 and was able to start voting.
I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you didn't get into you were on the school board in San Diego for years. You taught at San Diego State University, African Studies, I believe it was.
I was one of the founders of Africana Studies in 1972.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you took a while to get into politics yourself.
I was pulled into politics. I want to make that very clear to everybody who's listening. I was drafted into politics. I don't think I've ever volunteered to run for anything on my own. I was always active and involved. I was working at San Diego State University, establishing the Africana Studies Department, and helped establish Women's Studies and Chicano Studies. And just an activist to make sure kids had quality education, always at the school board raising these issues. And I got a call asking me to run. And I said, I'm sure there's someone else who can do it. Let me find you somebody. And I never said yes. And then eventually, about 4 or 5 months later, Ms. Pryor called and said, hey, we're having a meeting about your campaign and that you're running for school board. And I thought, wait a minute, didn't you guys go look for someone else? No. I said, okay, I'm in the midst of a career, but I'll give you 2 terms. So I did 2 terms, and I left. And the same is true here. I had basically done all I needed to do at the university in terms of work and research and taking our kids to Africa and community people and doing things. And I was retired. I was retired after almost 40 years at the university and was getting ready to go off and build this wonderful place in Jashi up in West Africa. And I got a call from a friend who made me feel guilty. And it was Tony Atkins who called and said, I got something to tell you. And she asked me, I thought, are you crazy?
Yeah.
Let's find somebody else.
Tony Atkins, who's now the head of the state Senate.
She
Speaker.
She became Speaker while I was there, and then President Pro Tem. And I knew very little about running for office in terms of at that level.
Yeah.
Had no sense of the significance of my election when I was elected, that I became the first African American south of Los Angeles to ever serve in a state office. And so as a result, I was like, wow, I'm going to have to do this now because Tony has talked me into it. And I felt indebted in many ways.
To who?
To California. California had been good to me. When I look at my past and the struggles that my family had, and I went to UCLA and got 3 degrees and owed $1,250 after 3 degrees. I knew that it had been good to me. And when I sat every day and listened to my colleagues and see what was happening at the time of the recession, we were doing some things at the university that I just couldn't stand because we were turning kids away and we were doing other things that we needed to do differently. And the attraction, Tony said to me, was that right now there's no one in the Assembly and the Senate who has more educational experience and advocacy than you, because you understand K-12 and post-secondary.
When you ran for the Assembly, you took on an incumbent, I think, didn't you?
Took on who?
An incumbent.
No.
Oh, you didn't?
It was a blank seat. It was an open seat. There were like 6 or 7 of us running, but it was an open seat.
For the Assembly?
For the Assembly.
Yeah.
An open seat.
You remember what the slogan for your campaign was?
I think it was, I will work for you or help you or something. I don't know. It's one of those.
Those were simpler times.
Yeah, those were simpler times. We didn't have a crisis in leadership. We didn't have a big problem occurring. We just wanted someone as a voice. And I had been a voice in that community for many years. And so I knew I could win the election. I wasn't afraid of it, but I didn't know if I wanted to do that with my life, what it would mean. And that was my real challenge. Is this going to make a difference? And I remember when I passed AB 392, the bill concerning police use of force, Tony Atkins whispered in my ear as it passed the Senate, this is why you are here.
Yeah. It was not an easy road for reforms like that. In fact, just this week, Governor Newsom signed a bill to enable the state to have a process to get rid of bad cops, to prevent them from going up the road and going to work for another police department. Talk about the pressure, the criticism, the lobbying that you face from law enforcement groups or other Democrats.
Someone told me, and I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, that law enforcement spent about $1 million trying to defame me and never could. And they always came after me, for reform. And most folks thought the things I did, nobody else could do. And mainly it was because I stayed focused. I'd also spent, my years supporting my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, on good legislation. And always having my door open to them for information, as well as always going to them and explaining to them in great detail what I was doing and why I was doing it. I never wrote anybody off. And that was one of the things that served me well, because when the police just started to try to defame me and say, well, she won't talk to people, she's not friendly, this and this, it was my Republican colleagues that said, you don't know her. You really don't know her. And as a result, they couldn't turn them against me. And most of them understood what I was doing. And they would say, you need to go back and talk to her. You need to negotiate with her. You need to listen to her. And that served me well, that I had that level of support among my colleagues, because I talked to everyone. And I knew many of them as friends and family members and those kinds of things, because even though we were in different parties, they were still good people. And I knew that.
Willie Brown used to say, never make a permanent enemy.
Exactly.
You have allies, and you never know when they'll be with you on the next thing.
And Willie Brown was a good friend of my husband's and mine, and I can remember how he used a lot of those good friends to stay as Speaker. Yeah.
Well, just I want to bring the governor in just a moment, but your husband, Daniel Weber, was, I think, a judge. He was active. He was an attorney in Los Angeles fighting for voting rights. And tell us about him. How did he get involved in that work, and did you meet him doing that work?
I met him at UCLA. He was in law school, and I met him at UCLA. And he was an activist then. He was active in recruiting students to the law school, African-American kids, students to law school. And they had one of the largest, I guess, most diverse law school classes when he was there. But when we married, he moved to San Diego, and he was a strong advocate for helping the African-American lawyers understand their social and political responsibility to the communities. That it was not just about them, but it had a broader mission, kind of like Thurgood Marshall. And he was always a strong advocate for that. He became very close to Jerry Brown, and the appointment of many of the judges that occurred during Jerry Brown's era, Daniel was involved. He was also president of the California Association of Black Lawyers. He was one of the founders of that organization that started here in the Bay Area. But he was a strong advocate, and our family was always engaged, and we spent a lot of our resources basically up and down the state helping to get people appointed to positions, because we believe very strongly that representation matters. He tried his best to get me to run for office, and I wouldn't do it.
What did he want you to run for?
Assembly. And I didn't do it. And I had small children, and you could only have one activist in a family when you have kids. I believe that very strongly. Otherwise, the kids will probably be angry and bitter all the time. And so I knew somebody had to shepherd Akilah and Akil through their times in life and make sure they were okay. And I didn't mind doing that and staying local with my engagement. Yeah. But everybody always, a lot of his friends, Willie Brown and others, always say they wonder what Daniel would say right now, since you're in this position as an assembly member and now as Secretary of State.
Well, let's bring in our other guest, somebody who, as we say, doesn't need any introduction. He was Secretary of State, as I said, elected in 1970, really revolutionized that office. He was California's youngest governor, and he was California's oldest governor when he was elected in 2010. He was the 34th governor and the 39th governor. And in between, he was the mayor of Oakland and the attorney general. Please welcome from Colusa County, Jerry Brown. Good to have you with us.
Good to be here. Looking forward to it.
So let's talk about the recall a little bit. You're up there in Colusa County with the family ranch. Colusa County voted 57% for the recall. Tell us, what was it like being a former Democratic two-time governor up there? Did you see a lot of, was it Trump country? I mean, was it really pro?
No, Oh, yeah, it's Trump country. I think the vote might have been a little higher. But around here, the people are very friendly. Neighbors, there's not a lot of neighbors. People have very large ranches because everything here is cows. And you need several thousand acres if you're going to feed those cows with the grass that grows around here. So, but people are worried about their water, their fences, stuff happens. And so I think I've not really engaged in a lot of political talk around here. Even the vaccine is a little bit controversial because it's a marker between conservatives and I won't call and liberals, just non-conservatives. And there's a lot of people aren't getting vaccinated. Now they're not running around, the bars and restaurants of San Francisco, so they do have some safety there. But there's ideology when you scratch. Even when something like when Trump basically did the sanctions on China, and China stopped buying almonds and walnuts from California, that devastated people. But there's so much belief around here in Trump. He said, well, he knows what he's doing. Something had to be done, and it's going to work out. So yes, this is a different kind of.
Yeah.
It's not San Francisco. No. Not even close.
No.
We don't.
What did the recall? Did it feel? Were people talking about it there at Granzella's, the one place I think where everybody kind of meets up to have a beer?
Well, I haven't been in Granzella since the virus started, but a couple of people would talk about. But no, I must say I'm staying away. I'm not getting much political talk. Walking out my door. I got a lot of political talk on Zoom and on the telephone, and when I go to Sacramento or the city, but not there. No.
Well, let's talk about the recall because, first of all, Secretary of State Weber, this is what you walked into, right? Your first big task, you've got to oversee this recall election, which, had been percolating, so it probably wasn't a shock. But nonetheless, probably not what you would have preferred, right?
Would have preferred to do something else with the time and the money, but we knew it was coming. We had a sense that it was coming based on the data that we had. And so my goal was to try to make sure that we could administer it so that it would be fair enough and so that the results would be accepted. Because, if I had dib-dab in it and twisted too many things and turned too many levers, folks would not believe the results. And so my goal was to make sure.
Was there pressure to dib-dab?
Well, there wasn't pressure to do it, but people assume that you can do those things. And I just wanted to make sure that we didn't. There wasn't any pressure. People don't put pressure on me. I'm too old for pressure. Jerry knows that. We both are too old for that. But
Governor Brown, did you try to pressure her when she was in the assembly?
No.
No, I don't think so. No, it all works out fine. We either get a bill or we don't.
Yeah.
I either sign it or I don't. So it all goes on.
Yeah. But one of the things
have a lot more in common than not.
Yeah, we do.
I want to talk about that. But one of the things you really locked horns with Governor Newsom. Newsom appoints you to be Secretary of State, and then he sues you,
right?
Because he wanted to have a D next to his name, even though his attorneys failed. They missed the deadline,
right?
And so basically, he wanted you to give him a mulligan and just let.
Well, one of the things we did was we looked very carefully at the laws and the rules, and they were very clear that I could not change it. I mean, the law said it cannot be changed. So it was, I'm not having been on the school board and having been married to a lawyer, lawsuits don't scare me a whole lot because that's just the way life is. And as Secretary of State, we're sued every day, and the governor knows that we have lots of lawsuits. So I don't get freaked out about it. Some people did, and how could he sue you? And I said, well, he wasn't suing me. He was suing the Secretary of State. He wasn't suing Shirley Weber personally. And he was basically trying to get a judgment. And if he had gotten that judgment, we would have not opposed to it, but we could not do it ourselves because there were so many flaws in the recall election, the process itself, that we were doing the best we could to navigate it so that it was fair. And so his lawyers tried to get a D next to his name and didn't, and that was it. Never heard a word, never had an argument, never had a discussion about it.
Have you talked to him since?
We talked, and I texted him congratulations and that kind of stuff, and I think we had a conversation with something else that was totally unrelated to it. Yeah. But never a conversation about that because I think he knew as well as I did, but at the same time, because that law is so so loose and that kind of thing, he took a shot to try to get it changed.
Yeah. Governor, when you were in office in Sacramento, there was a bill sent to your desk that would have required presidential candidates in primary elections to disclose their taxes, and others as well, including gubernatorial candidates, I think all statewide candidates. And you vetoed that bill. It was very clearly aimed at getting Donald Trump to release his taxes, and you vetoed it. And it was obviously passed by Democrats. That's who's in the majority up there, supermajority. And you said, I don't think this is constitutional. And you vetoed it. And then Governor Newsom signed a similar bill, and it was struck down. Talk about the politics of that.
Well, that was my understanding, and the understanding of my lawyers, that a state can't add new requirements for somebody who wants to run for a federal office. And I had known that, because I'd worked on a case, even in law school, where there was a claim where this issue came up. And I'd researched it way back in 1963, around 64, around that election. And the qualifications to run for Congress, for the U.S. Senate, or for president are in the U.S. Constitution. And there have been a number of cases where people say, well, you can't be a communist, you can't be this, you can't be that. No, if it's not in the Constitution, then you can't do it. So I knew this was not legal, and it proved to be correct.
Yeah. And so was that a case of sort of what Secretary Weber was saying a moment ago, of Democrats trying to put their thumb on the scale of elections?
You know, this thing about getting everybody's income tax is very popular. You know, my father told me a long time ago, he said, I'm not going to show my income tax. People are going to see how poor I am. So that was his argument. He didn't want to show what he had and what he didn't have.
Well, if you're a Democrat, that's a good thing, though, to be poor.
Well, that's what he said, and maybe he didn't really mean that. But you know, there's a lot more. Look, there's a lot more snooping into business in a way there never was. I mean, the way the legislature could work, this fishbowl routine has some benefits, but it has liabilities as well. So I'm not overly excited about getting the income tax or not. But in that case, I vetoed it because it was illegal. Now, you know, I've given my income tax in some cases, and in other cases I haven't. In fact, one time when Meg was running, I wanted to challenge her because I thought she'd have a lot of money and questionable income tax. So Meg Whitman, when I was running for governor the third time. And so I went, so I'll go collect all my income taxes because she said, you got to have 20 years. Well, it just turned out that I couldn't find all my income taxes. So I'm never too anxious to have to disclose records, particularly when I don't have them.
Yeah. So the judge struck down the presidential part of that law, but remaining is the rest of it, which requires gubernatorial candidates and others in primaries to disclose, I think, 5 years of taxes. And so the Secretary of State is empowered to say what the criteria are if you want to run for governor in a recall. And one of the criterion that you mentioned was that you had to disclose your taxes. Right. And I think it was Larry Elder took you to court and won.
He won not because he didn't disclose them. He won because we had disqualified him because he claims we didn't give him either enough time or opportunity to make the corrections that were there. But they never struck down that you couldn't show them.
But the judge, I think, said a recall is not a primary.
Right, he did say that, but he didn't say you can't ask for taxes. It was really weird the way he put it together. We decided to remove it just so that we could move on. Yeah. I mean, that was our thing, and we felt, and as always, we kept saying, you know, this legislation is very, very loose. It gives you authority to do things, and then you do it, and then people get sued, and then you have to go back and forth, and what's there and what's not there to be done. So we decided after that we take them down, but there is legislation now to make it a part of the recall.
Yeah, one of the problems, not having been a legislator, I'm not as sympathetic as probably Shirley is, but every year they come up with 1,000 new laws. Not all, but many of those laws have minute prescriptions, orders. Do this, turn left, turn right, count to 10, do this. And every time you make a very precise law, reality turns out to be a little different. Then you have another law. And then reality turns out to be different again, then you have another law. You get so damn many laws affecting schools, affecting elections. Obviously, you have lawsuits. And of course, the lawyers like to make these laws, and the lawyers like to bring the lawsuits. And they like to become judges, to Jason lawsuits. So there's a bit of a self-reinforcing activity here in what some have called motorized legislation.
Well, I think you said there's 1,000 bills every year out of the legislature, but there aren't 1,000 good ideas.
I don't know if I said it, but I subscribe to it. Yeah. Well, there aren't 1,000 good ideas. People want, they want to have a little picture, put out their newsletter. And look, there was a time when there weren't that many new laws. There were general principles. And then the judges, when there was a dispute, they would decide. But now, and it's in part because of the mass society, we got almost 40 million people, not a million or two. So there's a lot more rules of the road that appear to be needed to keep the traffic going in the right lane. But I can tell you, this is not so good for our basic institutions because it's very litigious. We have lots of lawsuits. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. And it's hard to do things. Everything is contested. Now, some bad ideas get stopped with lawsuits, but you get a lot of blockage, and it's hard. When you talk about housing, people complain, why can't we get more housing? Well, everybody sues. And I have a charter school that I'm the chairman of in Oakland. I can tell you, we spend more time on the rules, the laws, on the contributions to the pension, the HR requirements, all sorts of notice. Every policy's got to have this, the Brown Act. I mean, we are, I know each individual law is good in itself, but the unintended cumulative impact is to, I want to say it, marginalize the most important function, which is the teacher and the student having that bond, that relationship together, whereby the child can be brought to a higher state of understanding and learning.
One of the things you two share is a willingness to sort of take on the status quo. You did that, Governor, when you ran for governor, actually. In 1974, you took on the Speaker of the Assembly and Joe Alioto, who was the mayor of San Francisco. You, Shirley Weber, took on the teachers union, even though you had been a teacher for 40 years. Over tenure, I think, was the issue.
A number of issues, yes. Tenure was one of them. Right.
Yeah, well, talk about that. I mean,
well, you have to take I always tell people I'm not a semicolon and a period legislator, because there are lots of legislation, as the governor's mentioned, where people are just changing the words around a little bit, and in the end, it comes out and it's watered down, and it has very little impact on what's going on. Being an educator, number one, is extremely important to me. Having been a poor kid who was totally dependent upon quality education, that had I not had amazing teachers and an amazing curriculum and a drive to do it, I would not have achieved. And I understand that very clearly. So I can see in the faces of children the fact that we have not done the job that we need to do. So I never really, quote unquote, took on the teachers union. I fought on behalf of kids, and they took it as I'm taking them on. But I know that there are certain things that we have to do, and there's nothing more important in a classroom than a great teacher who needs support, who needs guidance, who needs whatever we need to give them. There's nothing more important than that. And we have to have expectations that they will be great teachers and help them to become great teachers. So yeah, I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher to my bone, really. But I also know that there's power in teaching. And I've seen how things I've done over the years have changed people's lives, and how teachers changed my life. So I take it very seriously, unlike others who would somehow realize what I was doing was good and could have been beneficial, but they were too afraid. They were more afraid of the union and what the union would or would not do for them. And I was not afraid. I was more afraid that I would not do what I knew I had to do, that I would just somehow or another fall into the trap and go along with everybody else and accept things. And there were times when committees watered down my bill and I refused to bring it forward because I was not going to put something out there that was not going to be beneficial. And when I saw things that were wrong, I did my best to try to correct it. The governor helped me with one of them. He understood what was going on, and that money was not, that we had set aside for reform, was not getting to the kids. So he authorized $300 million for me to give to kids who were behind, to close that achievement gap. And everybody's like,
is that the local funding formula?
It was, the local funding formula was one thing, but it wasn't getting to the kids with the greatest need. And that was a problem. And because we had defined it in such a way that many kids who were struggling were not getting the support they needed. And so as we were trying to change the formula, change how we funded it, I went to the governor and I said, you know, we talked about it, and he put his people on it, and we came with $300 million that we got for the kids who were the most behind for 2 years to basically get them the resources they need as we were trying to change the formula and change the focus. So I took on some hard issues. I took on things that made people uncomfortable. But I remember when I was sworn in as a school board, a guy who got sworn in at another school board said, "I have come to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable." And that is true. You know, you have to say, folks, I say, if you're comfortable with what we're doing, you need to be afflicted. Somebody needs to help you wake up. You need to be uncomfortable. You need to basically have a sense of urgency of getting something done. And so I didn't mind making people upset because people knew I wasn't doing it for Shirley. I was doing it for the kids who needed it in California.
Yeah. Bringing this back to elections, Governor used the phrase unintended consequences. I think you did. The governor just, I think last week, signed a bill that's going to make all future elections all mail ballots. So every voter, registered voter, will get a mail-in ballot, which they can use if they want to. Most people are voting that way now. I think the turnout in the recall was pretty high for a September election in an off year. It was 57, 58%, something like that. Governor, do you see any potential unintended consequences of mailing everybody a ballot?
Well, you know, I think that horse has left the stable. People like the convenience. You know, you can order things from FedEx and UPS and Amazon. So people want to get their ballot like they get everything else. I personally like to go to the polls. When I was a little kid, my father was running for district attorney. Like he ran when I was 5 years old. And I remember going to the polls. They had voting machines in San Francisco. And they had a little curtain. You pulled the curtain. I got to be in there and I could see them vote. So I'd like to, and then you'd see your neighbors because we were around the block. So I like to see the people. Sometimes you didn't even know who was there in your neighborhood. So I like going to the polls. Other people, my wife Ann, she liked to vote absentee. So, but I guess that's like a horse and buggy. We're going beyond that. The only trouble I could see, would there be mechanical problems? Would there be some question as to the authenticity? So we didn't hear anything about that. And it probably may turn out to get a lot more people to vote. So it probably is more modern. I mean, the next thing will be to vote, by email or something. Of course, they tried that in Russia, and there's some people who were not part of Putin's team that were winning. And when the email votes came in at the end there, Putin's guys won. So the old days you had a ballot. I guess they could stuff the ballot, but you had paper. So we got to make sure the integrity of the election. But it is convenient, and so I don't think we can have any other problems unless we have some.
Yeah.
I mean, so the Republicans get all excited about absentee ballot. They think it's some kind of big fraud. But so far in California, we haven't heard.
Yeah. One of the issues that Republicans have grabbed onto is this idea of what they call ballot harvesting. And that was a bill you signed, Governor, that allows a third party, like a labor union or a local county Democratic or Republican party, to go to people and collect their ballots and then turn them into the county. First, Governor, did you have any qualms about that? Because that is somewhat controversial.
No, just among you kind of higher end people. You always go to the election, you live in nice neighborhoods. But since the beginning of this republic, after they started letting people without property vote, and it was a slow going. But the immigrants in the 1900s in New York, you'd have to mobilize them. And that's what they did in New York City and in Chicago and other places. Maybe there was some corruption. But poor people have a lot on their plate. They got a lot going. And yet they have more stake in the election than anybody else. So I don't see anything wrong with mobilizing. That's what they did in Georgia. And I think that's all good. Mobilizing they used to have torchlight parade. You used to go around, I remember even in my time, people go around honking their horn. So there was mobilizing. That's something. So going to door, can I take your ballot? You have people who don't want to go out. You have all sorts of problems. So look, if the envelope is sealed, it's signed, hallelujah. What's the problem? I think it's a good thing. And I think it is really definitely the Republicans and those who are in a very privileged kind of situation don't have to worry about mobilizing the underclass. The lower income people vote less. That's a fact. And so to hear their voice, it takes, whether it's a labor union or a church or some activist group in the neighborhood community organization, I think that's all good. That's called participation.
Yeah. Secretary Weber, you have said after the recall, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with aspects of the recall, the fact that it was on the ballot, for example. And you talked, you and others, Senator Steve Glazer from across the bridge, talked about reforming California's recall process. Right. What are you thinking?
Well, we're thinking about a number of things. I just was on some call with Glazer as well as Berman today and yesterday to talk about what they have in mind and what we have in mind. And my view of it may be a little bit different, but it will come together in the end. I'm looking at getting some individuals who we all respect. One of them is my governor sitting in front of me, Jerry Brown, and possibly a couple of others who are known to be kind of sound-minded, fair, those kinds of things, to advise me and to hopefully get all the information. There's a lot of information going on. The last thing I want is to have like a big, massive show of everybody and their grandmama talking about the recall and what they want and what they don't want, and then in the end we end up with nothing. Okay, so I'm trying to put together a kind of a nonpartisan discussion with some experts to basically talk to everybody else and listen to others and have meetings maybe like this where they can get input. And then I'm hoping by the first of the year for them to give me a report concerning what they think. Yeah, it has to be, because it needs to be on the ballot in 2022. And so to give me a report would mean that this may be something that I would recommend to my elections committees across the street from my office, and hopefully have them fashion some legislation and have the legislators talk about it. I don't want it to be a partisan thing, because then it just blows up with regards to support and everybody's attacking it rather than participating and shaping it.
But if you make it harder, let's say you double the percentage of signatures needed from 12% to 25%, which I think is what most states do.
Right.
Republicans are going to squeal, right? I mean,
somebody's going to squeal about something. And but we hope that there will be enough support and enough input in the beginning that people understand why it has to be the way it is. I mean, right now I talk to my staff, and there are about 55 or 60 recalls being prepared in the state of California right now. Yeah. That is ridiculous. Some of the people haven't been in office an entire year, and folks have recall papers on them. Yeah. I mean, and so, and one of the things, in one of the surveys that was done at UC San Diego was that they think recall should be for cause. That it has to be derelict of duty, a violation of the law, or something that you can see, which pushes it more into an issue of basically an impeachment kind of thing, because you have somebody making a determination that this person has or has not violated the law. So, so we have to do something, because it's real clear that the way it is right now, people are frustrated. I mean, I heard lots of folks asking me, why are we having this? And I couldn't give them what I said, because the folks wanted it. And, well, how many people? You tell them, and they said it's a small number. Absolutely. And then they were equally concerned that it was possible that we'd have to have 50% plus one to take the governor out, but somebody could actually become governor with 20% of the vote. I mean, so people are asking, where's the fairness in that? And so it's clear that our process is going to, that as it currently exists, doesn't serve anyone well, period. And that, and if it turns out that we recall someone, we will probably, one guy said the only thing that would be sure if the recall went through was that we'd end up with a governor that the vast majority of people didn't like. Yeah. That was the one thing that was clear, because of the way the voting was going and the numbers and all that other stuff. So some say we need to have higher qualifications if you run in a recall as a replacement, because there's a lot less conversation about it. Yeah. Some say we need to have longer time that a person has to serve before you can try to recall them. Yeah. I mean, because we're seeing this happening almost right after an election, give the 60 or 90 days, whatever the city or county has, and then there's recall petitions. Yeah.
Governor, what, off the top of your head, what are some reforms you'd like to see considered?
Well, the first thing I would say, just from a political point of view, I believe this will have to go before the voters. And if you're telling the voters you want to lessen their power, you're going to have a pretty good case. So if it gets enmeshed in a lot of politics, now this is a Democratic state, and if it looks kind of pro-democratic, it might actually might help it. But I think the history, well, there's not that much history, but anytime you will go to the voter and you say, look, we want to take away some of your power. Up here in Sacramento, we have a better sense of it. So we want to limit the initiative or limit the referendum. And now in this case, the recall is kind of a different animal. And it is weird and not very democratic to say you can recall someone with 50%, but then the person who takes their place could get 20. So maybe that's something you could do. You could also say, okay, you're going to recall somebody, then the lieutenant governor takes over, or maybe the attorney general or something. So then at least you have a good, non-political, or maybe political, but serious. You wouldn't have somebody who didn't get any support. You'd have someone who got elected. Yeah. So I think it's going to be chancy. I know it's again, something that may not work doesn't mean you can make it better. So I'm very interested in how this thing can work, and there ought to be some improvements. But I think two points. One, really think through what these improvements are, and number two, are they the kind of improvements that will commend itself to 50.1% of the California?
Yeah, and the Berkeley IGS poll tested a bunch of ideas, including having the lieutenant governor take over. That was not popular. Okay. But I think the most popular one was to have a runoff between the top two vote getters among the replacement candidates to make sure one at least had 50% plus one. But then you're adding another election, unless you did ranked choice. I suppose you could do it something like that. But what do you think of that?
Well, I think I've talked to the folks who talk about ranked choice, and that's a possibility. It really is difficult because what happened in the last election is that, the Democrats didn't think they should ever put forth anybody. So the folks who ran, you probably wouldn't have wanted them. And if it had turned out that way and you had the top two vote getters, people might be furious because half of the people didn't even vote to basically do a replacement. And so we had very low numbers coming in for the replacement candidate. So, so people did not want to participate as if that would somehow or another sanction the recall by participating in choosing someone. So you'd have to do a lot of education to help people understand that this is not a bad thing to choose a replacement because that was a lot of effort not to do that. And we didn't have folks who really could become governor running. In terms of Democrats. Yeah. And so we didn't have folks with a lot of experience, legislators or whatever they may be, who really were folks who would look seriously at being a governor.
Yeah. Governor Brown, in 2003, of course, the lieutenant governor, Cruz Bustamante, ran as an alternative. He said no on the recall, but yes on Bustamante. A lot of people saw that as being kind of cynical. He and Gray Davis didn't get along. But what do you make of it worked out for Newsom, but what do you make of that strategy of making sure that you have no plan B for the Democrats, and you tell people to skip it?
Well, it turned out pretty darn good, pretty darn well. So whatever that strategy was, and I wasn't sure, like you, was this the right thing to do or a good thing to do? It turned out that simplifying it with all the election noise was a pretty smart thing. So what do I think of that? Well, look, politics is not some, recipe, 1, 2, 3. I mean, there's a lot of variation, and politicians figure out what works for elections. So that's what the Newsom people thought that would be good. The trouble with the recall is sometimes people really want to express themselves against kind of a monolithic status quo, and they want to shake things up, and the recall has that flavor. A problem is that basically to get it going, you need a lot of money. And then the money comes from special interests. So what's billed as a Democratic move is actually something from a very few privileged interest groups, powerful interest groups. So, I find basically whatever the rules are, if I run for office, I'm going to figure out how to win according to those rules. Keep changing the rules, whether it's checkers or chess or bridge. I don't think those rules have been changed. I think smart people will figure out how to maneuver. Newsom figured out how to maneuver, and he can raise $70 million. He's better off. Now, the only reason they had a recall was because of the COVID, and they had to give him more time. So maybe one very simple reform is judges can't give you more time. The time is the time. And we don't need, the recall is not such a fundamental liberty that because it was hard to collect signatures, we're going to go over the law and some judge is going to say, you have another 120 days. I never could understand that lawsuit. And that seems very odd to me. But there it was. I don't think it was ever even contested in the court. I would contest that. So one simple, right off the bat, the limit, you got to get it, I think 120 days or whatever the number is, no extensions, no matter what. And because it's not a big loss. I mean, we didn't have the recall, we'd be worse off. I mean, we'd be better off. It'd be less money we spent.
Yeah.
A couple $100 million we would have saved. So I think we want to look at this thing very carefully for two reasons. Always changing the rules doesn't necessarily make it better because human beings figure out a way to win. And smart people do better than not so smart people.
Yeah.
And secondly, you got to convince the people. And I have a hunch the people are not going to be too amenable to a sweeping recall reform.
Yeah. Let's talk about voting rights across the country because we're seeing in places like Georgia, Texas, some really restrictive laws. There's not a lot of optimism that the Supreme Court would strike those down if it got there. What do you see, Secretary Weber, as like the threat out there in terms of the fundamental democracy is under threat, or what exactly is going on here?
It's in my mind, it's really quite sad because I know how hard people fought for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, how to remove all the barriers, ensuring that everybody who was eligible had a right to go to the polls and to vote. And what we're seeing, because the Supreme Court is not supporting folks again with the Voting Rights Act, we're seeing states doing almost some of the most ridiculous things that people have ever heard of. As the governor mentioned, what they did in Georgia, they figured out how to get people to the polls. So Georgia then decides to write these laws, not that to ensure the election or make it better or safer, but basically to get the results that they want. And so they're saying, well, you can't give people water when they stand in line because why? They're going to make long lines in poor neighborhoods and it's going to be hot. So you can't give a person some water? How crazy can that be? The polls have to close at noon on Sunday or before noon on Sunday. Why? Because all the churches use their church buses to take their members to the polls to vote. So so now they got to choose between going to church or voting because a lot of folks didn't have transportation. So you find these things coming to play that if you want an absentee ballot, you have to get it notarized and you can't be a permanent absentee. And why? Because absentee ballots now work for poor people. People were skeptical about voting before, but now they do. And absentee ballots used to work for the affluent. They used it more than anyone. And so what's happening right now across the nation is there are all these laws. But what's happening in California is that while we can't get these draconian laws passed through our legislature, we're going to see those on the ballot. They're already talking about voter ID, other kinds of rules and regulations that's supposed to make our voting safer and more secure when there's no evidence that our voting is not.
Governor, what do you see as
Well, I just want to indicate, because I was Secretary of State and I used to look up these things. North Dakota, for a number of years, had no registration. You just go in and vote. And of course, I think people knew better, each other better. But look, what's going on, this is reflective of a very strong anti-democratic movement. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound partisan, but there are a lot of Republicans who because of their ideology, it's almost like a theological belief. They believe if the Democrats win, Satan is now sitting in the seat of power and has to be stopped by whatever means. And that's why whatever Trump does, whatever restrictions, it's good. Because the Democrats, because of their values, because of what they will do, and maybe because of the people they're associated with, in the minds of a minority of Americans, they're dangerous. And based on that ideology and that false and dangerous belief, many, many states are restricting the franchise. And even our whole system, where you have a few states can dictate to the majority. We've had a majority vote that has been ignored because the electoral system, because the way the Supreme Court ruled. I mean, we are in a crisis of democracy. And when McConnell sits up there and says, anything that the Democratic president wants, we're going to stop. Well, if we keep going down this road, you're going to have paralysis and you're going to have breakdown, and you're going to have violence. It's not pretty. So it's not just about a voter ID. That's just a little means by which they hope a few old people and poor people who don't have their photo or forgot it are going to be disenfranchised. So this is part of a much larger breakdown in America where the loser, in this case the Republicans, won't concede to the winner. And if that continues, we won't have a democracy. That I'm sure of. So these voting rights cases, these voting rights laws need to be fought, but we got to go much beyond that. We got to accept the rules of the game, and we're losing the ability to form a consensus. Hopefully in Washington now, they're going to figure out how to get some of these major bills done. But for the Republicans to stand there and say everything that Pelosi and Biden want is bad, there's nothing good, and that's preposterous. It is a demolition of the democratic foundations. It's very dangerous, very anti-democratic, and it risks, if it keeps going and getting worse, undermining and totally changing our form of government. So we're all worried about Putin and Xi. We have anti-democrats, subversives right here in high positions of power. And hopefully we're going to win the minds and hearts of the people. But it's an open question as of tonight.
Yeah. Secretary Weber, a lot of times, whether it's abortion rights or voting rights, people say, well, we're safe. Gay rights, we're safe in California. It's a blue state. It's not going to happen here. What would you say to that kind of
We have
attitude?
to fight not only for California, but for the nation. Because we can't, and we see this, we just can't have this perfect blue state and have all this other stuff happening, because we're affected by that. We're affected at the federal level by everything that happens. And when they're attacking women's right to choose and they're cutting off funding at clinics and other places, it affects California. It affects what we do. So we're not standing on the sideline. My office is engaged with all the lawsuits. We're submitting Friends of the Court briefs in Georgia and Texas and all around, because we're fighting for the right to vote, because that stuff creeps in over here. As I said, we're looking at people coming in here with various kind of petitions and propositions and those kinds of things that will limit people's right to vote without any evidence that those things are bad, that we have any problems. But they can't get it through the legislature, so they will fashion it and shape it in a way out of fear of the unknown here in California. And we're seeing that already coming through my office in terms of the documents and the petitions that are going to be there and what may end up being on the ballot in 2022. So we have to have a strong discussion about voting rights. And the governor's absolutely correct. I mean, this is the core issue of a democracy. And what we're seeing is embarrassing to us as we see the courts back off of it. They're going back to letting states' rights basically rule, which is what King talked about in '63 in his I Have a Dream speech about the nullification that's dripping from the lips of those in the South. That's exactly what's happening right now. Things that we counted on in the past, that our Supreme Court would be a fair arbiter of these issues about voting rights and those kinds. We're not seeing that. We're not seeing the defense of the democracy coming from them. And so when you start looking at it and you see the branches of government, you are fighting to basically try to restore and to keep our democracy. Most of us were shocked when January 6th happened, because that was like a playbook out of some other country, not here, some other country. And then people backed off and didn't want to investigate, didn't want to find the truth. And we're finding more and more every day that this stuff has infested the very core of this nation. We are in deep trouble. We're in deep trouble. And I'd say this to everyone: you've got to have a voice and you've got to speak up.
Yeah. Governor?
I do want to add, too, not just the violence and the attempt to take over the Congress there, but a Republican lawyer, I don't know whether he's working with, he sent it into Trump or whomever, but the point is, it was a 6-point plan to deny recognition. That's what they're trying to do.
That was John Eastman at Chapman University.
Chapman University, a respected Orange County notable who's a member of the bar, an officer of the court, was presenting a plan by which a number of state delegations would be disqualified. So there wouldn't be a majority. When there is not a majority, then the vote for president goes by the states, with each state, one vote for Rhode Island, one vote for California. Just so happens that there is a majority of one of the Republicans. So there's 26 states that will vote for Republican. So this guy was saying how the popular vote could be destroyed by these, I won't call them shenanigans. This was I think, a treasonous assault on the integrity of the American system, of our election. And it was done by respectable people who go down there to Orange County. They probably are very well respected. They belong to the local country club. They had a tenure. He was the head of that school down there. I mean, I think not only is it shocking, it is far more shocking than even that physical attack on the Capitol, because it was a plan, if carried out, could work, and the vote of the American people would be nullified. And boy, we're just lucky that Pence didn't go along with it, and they weren't able to disqualify. And you had some honest people in the elections office in Georgia and in Michigan and in Arizona. But under the new laws, they're going to turn it over to the politicians. And this system might work again. So we have to get our voting very clear so we don't get into a fight about who was really elected. And we have tens of millions who think Trump won the election. Well, we can't run this democracy too long if we have tens of millions of people who, despite what is the case, they don't believe it. So we're getting into a very irrational, polarized, ideological system, which is not, I know I want to make it sound dark, because it is dark. And we've got to recognize it, expose it, and fight it. Unfortunately, with 50-50 in the Senate and the Democrats divided on their side, Republicans totally unified. They got one idea: make Biden fail, get hold of the Congress, get Trump elected, or a Trump-like character, and then go whole hog. And then where the hell we are? You're gonna have a real trouble, because people aren't going to take that lying down.
Yeah, Secretary Weber, what can California do? What can young people do? You know, people who are active in politics right now. I mean, Governor Brown has really focused a lot of attention on things like climate change, but this is such a fundamental issue, and it's not. I mean, it's not one that's animating for a lot of people. I think, you know, in the way that say abortion is, for example.
Yeah. Well, what we're trying to do in California, and we're doing it with young people. I was at Fresno State the other day, and I'm holding town halls and in person, as well as broadcast live over the internet, town halls about voting rights in 1965. Who was my guest with me in Fresno was Dolores Huerta, and we talked about the whole issue, because a lot of folks don't understand what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was about. It did not grant people the right to vote. It ensured that folks couldn't block you from voting and make it difficult for you to vote. So we're doing that, as well as trying to share that. And I'll be up and down the state at all the universities to make sure that our young people understand that. But also, those of us here have to we have to be engaged in the other elections around the state, not only the ones here in California, but just like we did in Georgia. When we knew we needed to change the Senate, and we knew we needed to fight in Georgia, people across this nation rallied around Georgia to make sure that vote was secure. And there are going to be a number of attacks in the next election, particularly on secretaries of state in other states. We have to work to make sure that those folks are not under attack, because they're trying to replace them with people who will do exactly what the governor said in terms of changing the game and changing the rules so that the people's voice could be nullified. So we have to take this in California as a threat to us, because it is. And while we are fighting for the things that we want, we have to make sure that we are listening very carefully to what's happening in other states. We're lending our money, we're lending our time, the phone calls, the phone banking, whatever we need to do. We're doing that to defend these folks who are defending the democracy, because it is critical. And before I was sworn in, you know, when Governor Newsom nominated me, somebody talked to me about what the issue was, and I said, well, you know, our democracy is fragile right now. And they said, really? And they didn't believe me at the time. That was in December. And when January 6th hit, somebody called me and said, you said our democracy was fragile. I said, yes, you folks are missing all the signs. you're missing all the messages. I said, and when you travel around the world, and I've been in countries where an election is getting ready to occur, and everybody is nervous about what's going to happen, whether the military is going to get involved, whether this is going to involve. I said, and we have taken for granted this orderly transition of power, this way that we live, and we've not paid close attention to all the signs and symbols that are out there that we have been seeing for the last 4 or 5 years as to how folks are attacking everything that's there and creating lies, misinformation, and manipulating people to do things that normally they would not do.
Yeah. I think we're going to set up
yeah,
please.
I got to say one thing.
Yeah.
It's very important to realize what's going on here. There was a time when they had a poll tax, so the poor people, mostly African Americans, wouldn't vote. They had a literacy test, which they thought and did prevent African Americans. They even used violence, but those were two gimmicks that they used. Now they're not saying we're going to deny one group of people from voting. We're saying that there's fraud, that there's illegal aliens. There's people who don't belong in America, who are not citizens, and they're voting. Well, they're making this stuff up. But out of the fear of illegals voting or fraudulent voting, they're putting a bunch of burdens that they know and they hope will discourage people from voting that they don't want to vote. You know, people who would vote a more liberal or more progressive agenda, that the people sponsoring this. This is a very far-right conservative approach, not really conservative because it's so anti-American, but it's a radical approach that is following in the Jim Crow tradition, but it's doing in ostensibly neutral terms, preventing fraud, ensuring you're the person who you say you are with a photo. But they've studied, they know these are techniques of exclusion. So we're headed back to where we were when millions of Americans could not vote.
Yeah. I think we're going to set up a microphone here, and if anybody would like to come down and ask Dr. Weber or Governor Brown a question, feel free to do that. I'll call on you in just a moment. Oh my goodness, it's later than I thought it was.
We've been having fun.
Yeah. So if you have a question, just come on right down here. If you don't mind, say your name and where you live, if you feel like it, and what your question is.
Hi, my name is Chris Trudanek, and this is a question for Dr. Weber. This is a question about open source elections, which Secretary of State Alex Bida called the ultimate in transparency and accountability for all. Secretary of State Weber, in 2013, the state legislature passed Padilla's bill, SB 360, which lets counties pilot an open source voting system. One of the requirements of that bill was for the Secretary of State to adopt regulations around pilots, but that was never done. This past August, the presidents of the San Francisco and San Mateo County Boards of Supervisors wrote you a letter asking you to adopt regulations so they can have the option of doing a pilot during the November 2022 election. With 8 years having gone by after SB 360's passage, will you help finally get those regulations done in time so counties like San Francisco and San Mateo can do a pilot in the November 2022 election?
We're working on that now, and I want to apologize because the letter that was sent to me got to me like last week. And so I've sent that to the staff, and so we're working on that.
And that would allow counties to pilot?
Pilot this open source.
And what's the significance of that?
Well, he probably knows better than I. The open sources allows them to develop their own software and computer software and basically get engaged in that process.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
There is a risk with all this cyber power.
Right. Yeah.
They can start a nuclear bomb attack. They can turn off your hospital, the power. Can they change the election? It's all secret, but it may be that people can do that. So these voting machines have to be squeaky clean, perfect, open to observation. We got to know there can be no obscurity here, nothing hidden. That's what open source means. I'm all for it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Tricia Kelly Garland. I am very concerned. I feel like we're on the hijacked plane. We're heading towards the building, and there's really nothing to stop the GOP from winning in 2022, at least the House. The state legislatures have provisions and laws that allow them to overturn elections. There are Secretary of State candidates who believe in the big lie, who are willing to go along with, overturning elections. Without action from the federal government, this stuff we are on autopilot, going for the building, and everything's going to explode.
Can I ask if you have a question?
What do you do? What do we do? We're on the plane. We're going towards the building. How do we stop it?
It's a good question. I mean, it's like,
Maybe you change the pilot, but I think what...
Do you know what I mean? Because unless Manchin and Sinema do something and they carve out the filibuster and pass voting rights, which they're nowhere near doing that, we're doomed. Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Well, no, I feel your passion, and that's one of the reasons why it is so critically important for us to be engaged, not only here, but across the states, because it seems like there's no end to it, but you have to get engaged, and you're probably going to have to pick off a couple of their really important people and help them lose some elections. The problem with that right now is that many of the Republicans I know are afraid. They're afraid to stand up because they believe they will lose an election. And they're afraid that the wave is so strong that they have to go with it, even if they don't believe in it. And I've heard this from friends of mine.
Could we convert them?
Beg your pardon?
Could we convert them, talk to their children, do some sort of effort on that?
Well, I think much of their interest is, someone told me a long time ago, and I don't believe it always, but the first task of an elected official is to get reelected. I mean, and so what happens is that many of these folks are very afraid that they won't get reelected. But if some of them starts not being elected, or we make sure that those who are with us are reelected, then it sends a strong message to those about what you can manipulate and what you can't. But we have to be involved. I mean, I won't give up. I mean, I think it's the kind of thing that you figure, oh my God, what can we do? There's a lot we can do with our friends, our relatives.
Suppression, but these things where they overturn the whole result.
Governor, I'm curious what you think of Kristen Sinema from Arizona. In some ways, she's trying to be sort of the new, the Democrats' John McCain. Republicans love her, but if you talk to people who serve with her back there, they're a little, to say the least, perplexed. There's talk of primarying her, a Democratic opponent.
It's lucky we even have a Democrat in Arizona and West Virginia. This is a very conservative country. That's the way it is. California is so far off the deep end in terms of its current ideology vis-a-vis many other parts of America. So what's the answer? The answer is Pelosi is the strongest speaker we've ever had. She's going to deliver those votes. So they don't get $3.5 trillion. Get $1 trillion. That's pretty darn good. Get something and be around to fight another day. But I do think that the liberal-moderate split, liberals are saying, well, I want to see my issues in there, or I'm not going to vote. At some point, you got to herd the cats. Biden and Pelosi, I think, can get the job done because the logic is so clear. Democrats must pass it, and they got to make the compromises. Not everything, a lot of things could be better, but we got to be available for the next election. And that requires unity. It requires those bills, and we can't get too pure about it. So I think people will come together. I hope they will. I'm not prepared to say they won't until it doesn't happen. But we have Biden is wily. He's been there a long time. And Pelosi's been there a long time. And they're putting in a lot of energy. So I would think if for Noah, we got good leadership, and we have absolute logic that if the moderates and the progressives, if they don't come together as a one party, then Republicans will win, Trump will be back, and then those liberals can stew about that. So I would just say that. Now, I agree with a lot of what they say. I mean, America, the inequity has to be dealt with. But we do have to win this election, and let's take the infrastructure bill, that's $1.5 trillion, and then cut down the big reconciliation bill and get some money out of it. And then let's get ready for the election. Yeah. That is now, that's a guy who ran for office a lot and won most of the time. So that's from a winning point of view. There may be another point of view that I don't like to recognize.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll take maybe one more question. or
Hi,
two if you're quick.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. I just wanted to make statement for those of us that have been following this election security issue for decades. We believe you to be the perfect person at the perfect time because, as you mentioned, California can show leadership to the whole nation on this issue of election security. And I just wanted to make clear regarding the initial speaker, his comment. In San Francisco, we have this prime opportunity right now for a public voting system to come in that enjoys, when Governor Brown mentioned the difference between open source and the current systems, a much higher level of security as well as public taxpayer cost saving. So we just want to applaud you, and our efforts have been blessed by the Medgar Evers family. And when I hear your story, we just are very hopeful, and thanks for doing the work you do. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take one more question.
Good evening. This question is for Secretary of State. You mentioned your biggest concern with this recall was making sure the authenticity wouldn't be contested. So I wanted to ask, are you satisfied with the reception of the results? And more like, what I was more curious about was how do you measure that satisfaction?
Well, you know, we haven't had a lot of, even the number one contender admitted that the election was, that he won fair and square.
Newsom did.
Newsom won fair and square. And so, I mean, and that in itself, so we don't have all this, you know, this discussion of corruption and this and that and so forth and so on. We don't have that kind of conversation occurring with regards to the recall. And that was mainly what I'd hope we do, because as we move to other elections, trying to restore faith in California's election process, this was it. I was hoping that the results would be definitive. You know, that it wouldn't be like a few votes here and a few votes there and somebody else could have won. I mean, it was clear that people rejected the recall. So therefore, let's move on to the next point of the things that we have to do. And that was what I meant by it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask you both about something you're both involved in, which is the state oral history program that the Secretary of State oversees. Governor Brown was kind enough to put up with us for about 45 hours over the course of several months at his ranch, talking about his life and giving his version of California history. Talk about the importance of these archives, which are a treasure trove of conversations with everybody from your father, Governor, to legislators and many others.
Well, you know, one of the things when I became Secretary of State, that one of the real treasures is the archives. And I guess having taught history for so long, I recognize the power of history to remind us who we are and what our potential is and who we owe an allegiance to in terms of maintaining what we have. Without that kind of consciousness on the part of so many, people just will almost do anything. But when you have a sense of pride in how hard people struggle to give you a chance, how hard they fought to get you where you are, it changes your view of the world. It changes who you belong to and what you're going to fight for and the values that you have. And that's why, you know, I embrace my history with my father's past so clearly, because his struggle was hard. And so when I sometimes am confronted with fighting the police or the teachers union or whatever bill it is, I always tell folks, you know, when I think I'm just about tired of it, I have to think about him. I have to think about those people on the bridge in Selma. I have to think about those folks who laid a foundation for us that had much more difficult circumstances than we'd ever face, and yet they still took the challenge. Yeah. And so our legacy in California is a great legacy. And what we've tried to do with the archives is, I'm working with our archivists to make sure we expand it out, that we not only get the governor and his family and others, but we have also so many other Californians who have really made real significant contributions that inspire us to do even greater things. And so it's a wonderful thing to have, our archives. We're trying to digitize everything so that people will not have to come to Sacramento to take advantage of it, but can sit at home and click on it. And people are hungry for their past. If you notice, the biggest thing is Ancestry.com. Everybody wants to know who their ancestors were. And I've had friends that, that are non-African Americans who found their ancestors, who found who they really were. They thought they were somebody else, and all of a sudden they have other kinds of history. And that helps them to explain their world, but it also helps to ensure their presence and their future. So the archives are great. I love it.
Governor, what would you add to that?
I don't think I could add anything. I think she said it well.
Yeah. You bothered, like I said, you put up with us for about 45 hours. Why was it important to you to give your side of, you know?
Well, I don't know that it was important to me. You guys wanted it so bad, I didn't know what to do.
And in
Yeah, I
fact,
think it was all right. Well, yeah, why, I can't remember. I guess not to do it, yeah, I can't tell you. Look, that's in the past. It was a pleasure. You guys asked good questions. It was fun talking through all that history. You know, this is the kind of a dilemma. Do you want to live in the past, always looking back? Or do you want to be totally oblivious of the past because you're always living in the present, or maybe trying to live in the future? So we do need to look at our past. I just look at, you know, America now is getting ready to have a war with China, getting very revved up about Taiwan and the South China Sea and all these other people. So there's a lot going on. We just, I won't get into that, but just be aware. Hang on to your fasten your seatbelt there. So I was just thinking about the Chinese. Didn't we treat them kind of bad in California? And so I found it on Google last night, a report of the election in December 1879, where about 97% of the people of California voted to exclude Chinese. It was an advisory election. And that election was used to stimulate the federal Congress and the president, it was Chester Arthur, to pass a Chinese Exclusion Act that would keep Chinese out for the next 10 years. So that's a real thing. And we need to be very sensitive about how we're perceived, because we got a lot of stuff here that is shameful. Now, that's not to say that if we were living then, would we be any better? Because there's been a lot of prejudice. I'm not trying to judge the past, other than to say that you know, we have our flaws. China has their flaws, Russia has their flaws, but America is not perfect. And even, you know, so I think that it's good to see the past, but we've got to live in the present and we've got to prepare for the future. So it is a balance. And I think there is a problem that as you get older, you get more and more interested in the past. So I just want to warn you, as you get older, don't spend too much time in the archives. Try to get out there, go to the beach, you know, get on a plane, go to New York, do something, but keep vital. But then when you come home, check out some of that old stuff because it's illuminating. For example, let's take the Native Americans. All I knew about Indians was cowboy and Indian movies. They were always trying to attack the cowboys. I had no idea of the massacres that went on just a few miles from where I'm sitting today. So we've got there's a lot of reason to study the archives and our history, and there's a lot of reason to be humble before we judge these other people that they're all so bad. Well, we got a lot of bad in our history. In fact, this recently, you know, 800,000 people died in these last 20 years because of wars we started. So I think it's good to work on the fundamentals and knowing the past, knowing about World War I, knowing about the California, what happened in the gold rush, knowing about the Native Americans. We had this first governor, Barnett. He said, well, look, we're going to have to exterminate the Native Americans. And what he said about the blacks, he said, well, they're going to be discriminated. So that'll make them discontent. So we just got to keep them out. So that was our first governor.
And more recently, internment of Japanese Americans.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's very recent. So there's a lot to learn. I don't think we ought to be taking down every idol and statue and changing every name. But I do think we need to put plaques out saying, this is the story. And we've learned from it. And now let's go forward in building a better society.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for all your public service and for being here and being part of KQED Live. Really appreciate it. And I want to invite people to check out kqed.org/live. We've got an event with Nancy Pelosi, if she doesn't cancel, October 13th right here and online as well. So thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
Governor, Secretary of State, thank you.
Thank you.